Kia ora koutou, welcome everyone to our webinar for the Draft Housing and Business Choice Plan Change. My name is Kate McRae, I'm Head of Communications and Engagement at Council. Thank you very much for taking part in this event. Webinars are a new avenue of engagement for us, not only because of the COVID impacts, but also because we want to offer residents more ways to engage with us, and hopefully we can connect with more people from different parts of the city and peninsula. Because this is a new forum for our team, please bear with us if there are a few bumps in the session. So, bit of an agenda tonight. Tonight we're going to be taking you through the proposed residential and business choice plan change, specifically residential intensification. But first I'd like to introduce the team behind the screen and let you know how you can participate even though your mics and cameras are turned off. Then I'll hand over to our planners who will explain the proposed changes and why they're happening. So tonight you're going to be hearing from Ike and David, who are our subject matter experts. And I'll just get Ike and David to turn on their cameras so we can see who we're looking at there. And we also have a team working behind the scenes to keep the session moving and to answer your questions. So thank you very much for the questions that you supplied during registration. We'll be popping up the answers in these in the Q&A section on here on Teams and also in Slido. So while your mics and cameras are switched off, so we can keep the session moving, we do have several ways that you can ask a question as the webinar progresses. So our preferred method is Slido. So if you've got the website Slido on your mobile or web browser and just enter that code that you can see up there on screen, 762020, and then when prompted, you're going to be directed to a Q&A screen and you can type in your questions there. Once you've typed in your questions, one of our moderators will be able to answer it, and we will also be answering some of those questions verbally as the session progresses. If you'd prefer not to use Slido, there are a couple of other ways that you can ask your questions. If you have the Microsoft Teams app, you can use the Q&A function, which you'll find at the top of your screen there. If you pop a question into that, it'll then appear in the right-hand banner down your screen. However, if you don't have the Microsoft Teams app, you can email us at engagement@ccc.govt.nz, and we'll be monitoring the inbox throughout the presentation. The team will be keeping an eye out for your questions, and you should see them answered in the chat and in Slido. We'll also be taking question breaks throughout the session, so if you're busy listening, you don't need to try to type at the same time. There will be times when we're going to pause. If you're in the app, you can also react, thumbs up, thumbs down to some of the questions and answers in the chat section, and you can also use the reactions tab at the top of your screen to respond to what's being said during the presentation. If you're having any trouble hearing, if you're experiencing sound issues, you can turn on live captions. Just go to the top of your screen there, there's three small dots, and if you click that more at the top of your screen and click to turn on live captions, which should be down the bottom of the drop-down box there. One last thing for me before we get underway, hopefully now you'll have seen the banner has come up to let you know that the session is being recorded. This recording will be made available to you and shared within our website in the next couple of days. I'll now hand over to Ike to start the presentation.
Kia ora koutou katoa. As Katie said, my name is Ike Kleinboss. I'm a senior policy planner here at the city planning team in Christchurch City Council, and here to talk to you today about the residential intensification proposal giving effect to the national legislation. Next slide, please. So as people are likely well aware, our population is changing and it is growing, demanding more varied and different types of housing typologies. The government direction, most notably through the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, and also recent changes to the Resource Management Act through the Enabling Housing and Supply and Other Matters Act, which came into effect late last year, helps really direct council to seek to address that housing choice, and this is principally what we're giving effect to through the housing and business choice plan change. So council really has the opportunity to shape how and where we go through the legislation and really decide how high we want to grow and where we want to concentrate growth when giving effect to legislation as well. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, the Enabling Housing Act is probably one of the most significant parts of this, and this has introduced what's known as medium density residential standards, otherwise colloquially known as MDRS. The MDRS standard most notably directs that 12-metre housing, high housing, or about 3-4 stories, can be constructed across most of the city, with up to 3 dwellings per section as well. Now, MDRS needs to be applied across what's known as all relevant residential zones within the urban environment, and that effectively means all of the residential zones within urban Christchurch as well. In terms of intensification over and above the MDRS, the 3-storey direction, we do have to also give effect to the National Policy Statement for Urban Development, known as the NPSUD, and this really directs how much more intensification must be enabled, principally within and around commercial centres throughout Christchurch. We can only really seek to reduce any of the intensification that's directed through what's known as qualifying matters, or areas that are really deemed to be specifically unsuitable for the increased intensification. But they aren't a way to stop all intensification, and there is quite a high evidence threshold that needs to go through in order to meet that prescriptive lens for qualifying matters as well. Through the likes of this legislation, there are also elements of neighbourhood approval and also subdivision, which are made more easy as well. So effectively, in terms of neighbourhood approval, only really when there is any form of breach for those MDRS standards, which really dictate the form of development within residential areas, can there be an avenue for a form of written approval. As long as you meet those standards, then there is an avenue available for neighbourhood approval or neighbour approval or otherwise as well. Similarly, in terms of subdivision controls, MDRS standards mean that council can really only control vacant lot subdivision. So this is the subdivision of land where no existing dwelling is contained or proposed. In the event where there is a proposed or an existing dwelling, the MDRS standards mean that there is no minimum vacant allotment size that can be directed through the district plan. Next slide, please. So in terms of what's within and outside of scope, effectively, like I said, all of the areas within urban residential zones are part of the scope for this plan change, as well as all of the commercial centres and their surrounds as well, including any other associated controls that are directed by legislation as well, such as the subdivision, like I mentioned, and fencing controls, engineering or access or otherwise. And the map there on the left is trying to highlight all of the residential and commercial areas that are deemed to be meeting this prescriptive lens for what's within the scope, being all of the areas within the urban environment as well. So what that means is that in terms of what is outside of our scope, that means any of the area that's outside of the urban environment, and that means that we aren't reviewing the likes of existing rural zones, so new greenfield areas or otherwise, or any other non-residential activities such as industrial or open space or special activity zones or otherwise. And it also means that any controls that seek to manage non-residential activities within the residential environment, such as home occupation controls, where someone may choose to run a home business from an existing dwelling, they're also not being reviewed as part of this intensification plan change as well. Next slide, please. So just delving further into what's within and outside of the scope, what's listed here are the residential zones that are contained within the district plan at the moment that are deemed to be within and outside of the scope. The legislation directs that any of those areas that are outside of the urban environment, and also that are what's known as large lot or settlement zones, those are also outside of scope for any direction for intensification. And what that means is that there are quite a large number of residential zones that are listed there that are within the scope of this intensification plan change. And those are the zones that are really set to are required to give effect to the medium density residential standards, being the 3 or 4 story development, and also the intensified development through MDRS, through the NPSUD, being that intensification within and around those commercial centres as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of the NPSUD for that intensification within and around those commercial centres, what that really requires is that there is a intensification that is provided for within a walkable catchment around the CBD zone, the central city zone. And so the legislation directs that this is providing for at least 6 stories within at least a walkable catchment from the CBD and metropolitan zones. Metropolitan zones are fairly well prescribed and defined through various pieces of planning legislation, and so council has determined actually that there are no centres that meet the metropolitan centre direction, and only for us the CBD really applies, so the central city zone that we have there. Walkability is generally considered to be about 400 metres, equaling about a 5-minute walking time. And the advice is that a minimum of about 10 minutes walking distance is provided for around that central city zone, and that is increased based on accessibility to amenities and housing demand as well. And so the walking catchment that's been applied for this purpose around the CBD is a catchment of about 15 minutes or 1.2 kilometres around the city centre zone. In terms of those other suburban commercial areas, the requirement really is to intensify within and adjacent to those suburban commercial centres, being quite a prescriptive lens of specific centres, and they're all defined as well through the national planning standards as well that we need to give effect to. And the degree of intensification that's provided for within and around those centres needs to be proportionate to the level of commercial activity and community services that's provided for within each of those centres as well. Next slide, please. So as I said, qualifying matters can be used to reduce intensification in some areas, but they aren't a way to negate all forms of intensification. It's important to remember that they really only apply within any form of MDRS level of intensification, that medium density intensification, and also the NPSUD intensification as well, which does affect both commercial and residential areas. Standard features or overlays that are contained within the district plan at the moment can be used to manage development elsewhere that don't fall in that. So we only really need to go through the process of identifying what's known as those qualifying matters, or all those constraints within those areas for MDRS and NPSUD intensification. And like I said, there's a fairly high threshold for that to be used as a qualifying matter to reduce intensification as well. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Right. So in terms of what our proposal is for qualifying matters, we are proposing to carry over most of the current district plan controls. So, oh, sorry, if you can just go back one slide. Sorry, Kieran. It's a little bit slow on this end. Apologies, everyone. Right, so like I was saying, we are proposing to carry over most of the current district plan controls. So that includes outstanding landscapes, vegetation, heritage areas, and cultural features as well. Existing utility and infrastructure related overlays such as railway, Littleton Port, Airport, and State Highway are also being proposed to carry over as qualifying matters. And any high risk natural hazard areas for the likes of rockfall, slope hazard, tsunami inundation, or high flood risk have also been sought to be carried over as qualifying matters. Just a point to raise in terms of natural hazard risk, it is very, very difficult to conceptualise any other form of natural hazard risk other than what is most significant, and that is because it's directed through the legislation as the scope only being refined by those that are matters of national importance, and so that means that only those that are significant natural hazard risk can be incorporated as qualifying matters to reduce or otherwise any form of intensification. In terms of new matters being proposed, we are proposing to introduce a setback from what's known as the 400 volt power line setback, or your traditional, I guess, power lines that run through streets, and that is really to protect their ongoing maintenance and operation of those lines in light of the level of intensification that could come online surrounding those areas as well. The Littleton Depot, City Depot in Hillsborough is also proposed to have an acoustic overlay there, just responding to the 24-hour operations that's there and the degree of intensification that could apply around there. Residential heritage areas and new items and settings are also proposed to be carried over through Plan Change 13, which is also out for pre-notification feedback. The radio corridors around the Justice and Emergency Services precinct to ensure that the emergency radio network can continue to operate in light of any intensification that may otherwise be enabled around that area is also sought to be protected. And also coastal hazards through Plan Change 12, which is also out for pre-notification feedback as well. That is sought to be carried over in terms of coastal inundation areas or coastal erosion areas as well as a qualifying matter. There are a few what's known as other matters that we are proposing to progress with as well, and that includes the likes of residential character areas, which are contained within the district plan at the moment, and also vacuum sewer constraint areas where there is a wastewater constraint for the likes of Aranui, Shirley and Precincts, and also the schedule of protected trees, noting that a large proportion of these trees need to be carried over as what's known as an other qualifying matter. So with each of these, there is a fair amount of evidence that needs to be generated and is being worked on at the moment to ensure that they can be carried over as qualifying matters as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of the process that council is required to go through to give effect to the residential intensification as well as the business aspects of this, this is a flowchart trying to I guess highlight the process that council needs to go through. So currently, council's going out for what's known as pre-notification feedback, and that is really set to ensure that there is an opportunity for the public to I guess have oversight over what council is proposing, and also to provide feedback on exactly how we have interpreted and given effect to the government regulation as well. So this is most important because under the regulation, once council agrees to notification and formally notifies the plan change, which needs to take place by the 20th of August this year, The MDRS components of this plan change will have immediate legal effect. And what that means is that from notification, the 3-story type development will be able to be completed as a permitted activity throughout all of those urban residential areas. Now, the process to provide submissions is also directed through the legislation. So there's a 20 working day period for written submissions, or about a month to provide written submissions on the formal plan change. Council is then required to provide a summary of all the submissions received, notify that summary in the council, and then the public is able to provide feedback on those further submissions. In terms of oversight for the overall proposal for council to give effect to this, this needs to be overseen by what's known as an independent hearings panel, or an IHP, and that is a group of suitably qualified experts that sit outside of council, that are not on council employees, that review both the submissions received and how council intends to respond to these submissions in the proposal itself. That independent hearings panel is then required to make a recommendation to council, which council must deliberate on and must do so by the 20th of August next year. What this means is that there is a 12-month window from notification to when council is required to make a decision. Now, council can either choose to agree to the recommendation and then the provisions will all come into effect, or council can choose to not agree to some or all of the recommendation. Those elements that are not agreed to will be left up to the Minister for the Environment to make the final call on how they are given effect to. So it's quite an important process to ensure that council is in agreement with the recommendation and can be given effect to by the 20th of August next year. Next slide, please.
So we've come to one of our question slides within the presentation. This is just an opportunity for you to put forward any questions if you've been listening and haven't had an opportunity to type anything. Just a reminder, you can go to Slido, enter in the code that you can see there on the screen. You also have the Q&A function if you are using Microsoft Teams app, or you can email us at engagement@ccc.govt.nz. So I've got a couple of questions that have been coming through across all of our platforms, and I was wondering, while we just get the team to give you time to ask some questions, if I could get the team to respond verbally to a couple. So the first one is, what's planned for the residential areas in the hills, please, guys? Could someone answer that one for us?
Yeah, sure, I can answer that one for you, Katie. So the residential hills area is what's known as a relevant residential zone under MDRS. And what that means is that the medium density residential standards need to apply to all of the residential hills areas where applicable. And so what that would mean is that the 3-story development or 12-metre high development and up to 3 units per site would be enabled across all of this area. What council has also proposed is to introduce what we've called a residential hills precinct, which effectively seeks to carry over the vacant lot subdivision area of the current zone, which is 650 square metres. And so what that means is that if subdivision occurs with a vacant parcel, so no existing or proposed dwelling, then it must achieve a 650 square metre area. The caveat being that under MDRS, if there is an existing or proposed dwelling done alongside subdivision, then there is no minimum subdivision size that can be enforced as well. So people will, under that direction, simply be able to subdivide around their existing dwellings if they so wish as well, subject to meeting all of the associated setbacks, reception plans and so forth as well.
Just wondering, another question that's come in is around this concept of walkable distance. What's considered a walkable distance? How far out do you have the intensification? Could you talk a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, sure. So in a moment, I'll cover off some of the different walkable catchments that we've applied for the suburban commercial areas. But for the CBD, the direction is to have an intensification of at least 6 stories within at least a walkable catchment. And the advice from the Ministry of Environment suggests that this is at least 800 metres or a 10-minute walking catchment, and that needs to increase based on the other relevant policies of the NPSUD, the National Policy Statement for Urban Development, most notably around the level of accessibility that is provided and housing demand and services provided within the centre as well. So the centre of Christchurch, the city centre itself, is really deemed to be, funnily enough, the largest centre providing the most services available, and also has a high degree of housing demand as well. And so for that reason, we've chosen to go with a 15-minute walking catchment, which equates to 1.2 kilometres around the edge of the CBD as well. And in terms of heights, it's a cascading height, so those areas that are in the closest proximity to the CBD are enabled via consent to go up to 10 stories. This cascades down the further you go out, enabling up to 6 stories, and then reverting to MDRS being 12 metres thereafter.
Excellent, thank you very much. Look, we might kick on with the presentation. We do have opportunities throughout that are still to come to ask more questions. So shall we continue on?
Great, so now just talk about some of the specific zones that are being proposed, the precincts that we're introducing, and also I'll get a member of our team to cover off the urban design controls as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of the zones that are being proposed for residential controls, there are 2 zones that are being proposed. Effectively what this means is that those areas that are surrounding the larger suburban commercial and also city centre are proposed to be the high density residential zone, and all areas that are outside of this that are within urban residential areas are proposed to be the medium density residential zone. What this means is that within the medium density residential zone, it gives effect to the MDRS direction, and so that's permitted to do without consent to build up to 3 dwellings at 12 metres, which is between 3 and 4 stories high for all residential lots. There's also an enabling consent of up to 14 metres, 4 stories that's provided for as well, so you can go up to 4 stories via consent, and there are urban design and other controls for that as well. In the high density zone, like I said, that is around all of those larger commercial centres, except for the local centre being the smaller centre, and that does provide for up to 14 metres or about 4 stories without consent. So it does modify the MDRS control of 12 metres by an extra 2 metres as well, and also giving effect to MDRS 3 dwellings per site is also achievable as well. Like I said before, there is an enabling consent regime that's there that provides for up to 6 stories or 20 metres for most of the zone, and there's a 10-storey enabling consent regime as well that's also been applied specifically only around the CBD as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of the precincts that we're proposing, these are as follows. They really seek to respond to local features and really provide a little bit more nuance to what the underlying zone controls are. So like I said before, there is a suburban centres response, and so there are a variety of different precincts that are being proposed for these areas. So there's a local centre, large local centre, town centre, and emerging metropolitan centre. Local centre being the smallest of the centres, and then emerging metro being the largest of the centres. And the response to that really seeks to respond to that requirement to provide for a degree of intensification that is proportionate to the degree of services provided for within each of these centres. In terms of the precinct for the outer CBD living area, that is captured by the high density residential precinct as well, and that's really seeking to provide some cascade, if you will, from the CBD having an unlimited height, surrounding high density area being 10 stories, and then going further down to 6 stories. And so the high density residential precinct really directs a 6-story limit there via consent. Like I earlier said as well, there's the Residential Hills precinct as well, which is that minimum vacant allotment size at 650, and also transfers over, if you will, the existing Residential Hill earthwork controls as well. There's also a greenfields precinct that's been proposed, and this is really trying to capture the existing vacant greenfield sites that we have within what's known as the residential new neighbourhood zone. And this is trying to provide a financial incentive to make, I guess, efficient land use or development of the site. So at the moment, those existing vacant residential new neighbourhood zones require 15 dwellings per hectare to be achieved at a minimum. So that equates to in the order of about 500 square metre sites. And so through the MDRS direction, this is liberalised by a fair degree. And so what we've chosen to propose is to introduce a financial contribution incentive there to say that, yep, if 15 dwellings a hectare are achieved and you're making efficient land use of the vacant land that's available, then there's no financial contribution that needs to be paid. However, if you don't achieve that, then there will be a fee that is effectively paid to pay for the additional cost on servicing a lower density form of living within those areas. The last one is the wastewater constraints precinct, which really seeks to capture the vacuum sewer constraint that I mentioned earlier around the likes of Aranui, Shirley and the Prestons area as well. Next slide, please. So like I said before, there's an intensification that's directed around the suburban centres. And so this table provides an overview for the different centre types that we are seeking to respond to, where their locations are, the extent to which we are seeking to intensify around those areas, and by what degree as well. So the smaller centre is your neighbourhood and local centre that's there. And so those are the likes of Addington, Fendleton, Edgware, St Martins and such. And so we're not proposing to have any intensification above and beyond what is directed, being the MDRS, around that area. They really don't really align in terms of the degree of services that are provided for within each of those centres, and so we're only seeking to change the commercial controls to ensure that it's the same height as what's directed through MDRS, being 12 metres. For the larger local centres, which is Bishopdale, Barrington and Prestons, in an area of about 200 metres around those areas, there's an enabled height of 14 metres that is proposed for around those areas. And then growing slightly larger there again, the significant local centres being the likes of Merivale and Sydenham, they are proposed to be intensified to an extent of 400 metres or 5-minute walking catchment around those centres, to a height of up to 6 stories via consent as well. And this is the same for the town centre type of centre, which is Church Corner, Linwood, North Horsell, a few others as well. And the last one to mention is the what we've called the emerging metropolitan centre. And so we've applied this in Riccarton, Hornby and Papanui. And so these are areas that we believe that in time are likely to transition to what is called a metropolitan centre, I mentioned earlier. And these are fairly significant sub-regional centres that are quite a focal point for a larger area. And so to give effect to this, we have proposed an extent of 600 metres around these what we've called emerging metropolitan centres, of up to 6 stories being enabled via consent as well. Next slide, please. So this is a picture of the overall result, I guess, of the intensification direction for centres that we have proposed. And this image is provided for within the engagement material that we have on the Have Your Say and the Plan Change 14 webpage as well. So what you can see there are all the different centre types that we have responding again to the degree of services that are provided there and how far they go. Reminding you that it's a graphic representation really of the different centres that we have there also. Next slide, please. So like I said before, this is I guess an overview of the walkable catchment for the CBD. So there is a requirement through the NPSUD, the National Policy Statement for Urban Development, to realise as much development capacity as possible, which really translates into having no real set height limits within the CBD. It doesn't mean to say that in the future people will be able to build as they please. It simply means that it is treated on a case-by-case basis through a resource consent process to address the merits and the effects thereof for each of those developments. And that is really within that darker centre that we can see on the image there, around, I guess, the Cathedral Square there, and then going up Victoria Street there. Like I said before, there's also a requirement to enable at least 6 stories within at least a walkable catchment from the CBD. And so a 15-minute walking catchment has been applied, which is the blue dashed line that you can see there on the image, which is also available on the online mapping that we have as well. And so what this means is that the nearest residential, high-density residential area from the CBD is enabled up to 10 stories and then cascades down to 6 stories beyond that. And in this image, what that means is that going outwards from the darker centre area, the peach area that we have is the 10-storey extent there, and then that cascades outwards to the green extent there being 6 stories. Next slide, please.
So another opportunity for questions now. Just a reminder, we are recording this webinar. It will be available on our website along with the presentation, and we'll also be doing a transcript of the questions that we're being asked across all of our platforms. So if we're unable to answer your question tonight, or if you're not comfortable writing a question, then we will make all of this available within the next couple of days on our website. So I have one question here I'd like to ask Mike, please, and it's around just because you can build up to sort of 3 or 4 stories or 6 stories with consent, does it mean to say you absolutely have to?
Good question. So in terms of council's obligation, we have to enable the possibility to do so, and so that's one thing, putting that aside. So MDRS being the 3 stories, and then the NPSUD directing the 6 or more stories. However, touching on the other part of the question, it doesn't mean to say you have to at all. If you want to build a single level, detached dwelling, then you're more than able to do so. It's simply enabling the possibility of developing to that level. Excellent,
thank you for that. So I'll just give everyone just another moment just to see if they can get their questions through. And then we might continue on with the presentation. Again, there will be another opportunity to ask questions. Actually, I've got one question here. Can you explain the financial contributions for replanting trees around the city? And are you concerned that there may be areas of development that have no shade or tree cover? Because we already have an inequity of green space and access to green space around Christchurch.
Yeah, sure. So council is proposing to introduce a new, what's known as financial contribution to I guess incentivise the planting of trees as part of any development for residential and also for commercial development. And so what that means is that for the residential development, the financial contribution states that if 20% tree canopy cover is provided for a site, then there is no financial contribution that needs to be paid. However, if this isn't achieved, then there's a financial contribution that must be paid, and this money will go towards council's plan to plant for trees within council land, so most notably through park spaces as well. And so this is really building on the MDRS direction for landscaping. So the MDRS direction states that yes, there is quite a high degree of intensification that's directed in terms of what's called the 3 and 3 model, the 3 stories and 3 units, but also any of that development needs to be done in accordance with the landscaping provision, which states that 20% of the site must be landscaped when giving effect to this enablement, I guess, and that can include 20% of the tree canopy cover as well. So that has been reflected, and we are seeking, as I said before, to protect all of the existing trees within the schedule of trees, as well as a qualifying matter to ensure that they cannot be removed in light of the intensification that is being enabled and directed by council through this plan change. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Right, we'll continue on with the presentation. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Katie. Next slide, please. So in terms of the overall picture for the 2 zones, like I mentioned, the existing controls that we have in the district plan will be drastically simplified. So you might recall the slide that I had earlier showing all the different zones that are within scope. Those will effectively be simplified and distilled down to 2 zones. And so what that means is that for the medium density zone, MDRS 3 stories or up to 12 metres in height, no consent is required, and there's an enabling consent that is possible for up to 4 stories, and that increases in terms of evidence required beyond 5, or at or beyond 5, I should say. And so subdivision, like I said, is captured at 400 square metres for vacant, and there is no minimum allotment size that can be directed when there is an existing or proposed dwelling. And there are a few additional controls that have been introduced as well, which we'll cover off in a moment. In terms of the high density zone, 4 stories is permitted to be constructed without consent, and there's an enabling consent regime between 6 to 10 stories as well, increasing in evidence beyond this. Subdivision for vacant is set at 300 square metres, and again there is no minimum that is able to be set for existing or proposed dwellings that's there. And there are also some prescriptive form controls for developments between 5 to 10 stories as well, which we'll get into in a moment as well. Next slide, please. Great, so this is an overview for, I guess as a summary for all the different zones and all the different precincts in terms of height that's there. And so there is a fair restriction that the NPSUD implies in terms of the consenting framework that can be enacted. And so the permitted level without consent, as we've talked about, is as follows. So 12 metres for the medium density residential zone, and then 14 metres for all the other zones in the precincts as well. There's an enabling consent regime, like I said, for the medium density up to 14 metres, 10 stories for the high density as long as there isn't any precinct that's there, and then up to 20 metres or 6 stories for the other precincts for the centres as well. Next slide, please. In terms of the controls that are there, MDRS is really most similar to medium density, the existing medium density controls that we have within the district plan. So there are some good design outcomes that do need to be achieved, but we've also sought to, I guess, modify the MDRS controls, which we are able to do, but only if we are making them more lenient as well. So I'll quickly run through some of those. So for example, there is an incentive-based rule that states that if there are 2 or more dwellings proposed for development, that no recession planes will apply along the front portion of a site. And so that recognises that the rear of a site has the greatest degree of privacy and amenity, and ensures really that there's a greater street connectivity along the front of the site, leaving the rear for private space. Also, there's a requirement in MDRS for street-facing glazing to be introduced at 20%, and we've sought to liberalise this a little bit further to state that the gable end is not to be counted as part of that 20%. There's also additional building separation controls as well in certain heights, ground floor habitable room controls, storage controls introduced, and then also form controls for beyond or at and beyond 6 stories as well, which we'll touch on in a moment. And there's lastly also controls in the high density zone for reduced outdoor living requirements for 1 bed or studio units as well. And so to touch on some of the urban design matters, I'd like to hand over to David Haddam, who's a Senior Urban Design Advisor at Council.
Thanks, Ike. If we'll go on to the next slide, please. So, as Ike said, the MDRS is most similar to a medium density zone, and in Christchurch that's the residential medium density zone, which is found in the area around the inner city. So existing examples of this type of development are in places like Sydenham, Addington and Edgware. And currently in this area, we did some research a while ago, and our findings were that we quite consistently achieve satisfactory or good outcomes from development that occurs here. And I've just put up an example of a typical type of development. This particular one's from Addington, that shows some of the aspects of good design that we often see, which is that the building has a very strong connection to the street. It has doors and windows that face the street from behind a front garden area. The outdoor living space is situated at the side where it's private, so there's no sort of conflict between people who are seeking privacy within their own garden area and a nice, active, well-observed streetscape. And there's also a good and positive connection between the access way, so that when people walk to their front doors, it's a nice environment to walk on. It's well overlooked. There's planting and windows facing it. So the experience of getting from the street to the front door is a good one. And that's some of the things that we achieve in urban design, which at the moment, the way the plan is set out, it generally does get good results. And so we're keen to carry that forward. In other areas other than medium density, we didn't necessarily have quite such positive outcomes. And so what we're trying to seek is to carry forward the parts of the plan that are currently working well. Can I have the next slide, please? So with the MDRS, you are able to build 3 dwellings as of right. Beyond that, a resource consent is required, similar to what's currently required in the medium density zone. So in that way, it really is a rezoning of most of the city to medium density. And so if you want to look at how we think the city will look, the best guide is those places I mentioned, Addington, Edgware, parts of Maryvale and Linwood, where there's existing medium density being built all the time. When we get consents in, when we get more than 3 units, we will assess them, or it's more than 3, isn't it? And we'll assess those using the residential design principles, which are the assessment matters that are in the existing plan. We will be making a few tweaks to them, but essentially we want to carry those forward because they're seen to work. And the key areas of focus for those are the way the houses address the street and the accessways, the public areas of development, that we get houses that present well to the street and have aspects of safe design. Can I have the next slide, please? Just a very brief summary of what those principles are. We look at different aspects of the design to make sure that the development as a whole achieves a high standard of design. Principle among those is that it has a good layout, because if the buildings are in the wrong position, then there's not much you can really do to recover from that. You can, try and add windows and, materials and things, but really the development's never going to work. And so that's the first thing, is to get the site layout right, with the building facing the street in a positive way, for instance. And from there, we would then look at the relationship to the street. That example I showed you with the windows and the doors facing the street behind the garden. The built form and the appearance is important. It's not it's not really about the character. It's really about achieving that positive relationship, achieving a building that's not too bulky, that fits within its context in a reasonable manner, is reasonably interesting to look at. And we also consider aspects of residential amenity. We'll have to include the new provisions for outdoor space, and that are a reduction in what we have now. But we would still expect developments to have a high standard of amenity in terms of there's a garden, there's landscaping that's attractive for people to be in. And it all has to work in terms of providing access, not just in terms of cars can get into the spaces, but also that it's a safe environment for people to walk down, for children to access. There's space for bins and washing lines, and all the functional aspects of the development work and don't interfere with the high amenity. And safety is another area that we will continue to be concerned of, that there's lighting and good observation of those areas, that the city is a safe place to be in. Can I have the next slide, please? So the high density residential zone is a new zone. It's for a large extent, it's a more intense form of development than what we have at the moment. So it's, in terms of height, there's more height and more density than is achieved even in most of the central city. And this zone, as I think Ike will show you, extends around the perimeter of the central city and beyond. What we've tried to do is think about how a high density environment works. We've looked at some of the great cities around the world, and also other places in similar environments to Christchurch. So we've looked at what happens in Australia, as well as places like Europe, Barcelona and Berlin, and American cities. What we find is that high density works best when it's located towards the street front, and the reason for that is you can borrow amenity from the street. All the windows are looking out over the street rather than over next door. And so we've put in place some measures to try and encourage people to build towards the front of the site rather than towards the rear. And the way that works is that there aren't proposed to be any recession planes in the first 20 metres of the site. And the point of that is the building is then encouraged to be at the front of the site, and there's open space at the rear. Recession planes actually aren't that effective with tall buildings because the sun drops below the height of the building. And so the best way to manage in that situation is to create open space at the front and the rear so that there's space where light can penetrate. Also, the benefit of this form of development is that it has a really strong street interface. It really defines the street well to create that kind of positive street interface that you see in places like the European cities. There's also an aspect of yield to this, in that the point of the MDRS and what we're required to do is to ensure that most sites are developable with high density, and allowing development at the front of the site without recession planes is a way of making those sites developable. Otherwise, we're in a situation where we have to try and work out how to get an alternative envelope that will accommodate that. So it's a pragmatic solution to that. Next slide, please. So the last example was trying to show a basic bulk model of a 6-storey building, which is a type of development that we don't often see in Christchurch at the moment. It generally, if it happens, it generally is around Hagley Park because that's the most desirable land. We do have a zone around there, around Castle Mill, which allows for higher heights than other areas. And one of the ways that it does that is it removes recession planes and instead has a setback. And that's sort of that idea of the light percolates between the buildings rather than over the top of through the recession plane. And that's how we intend to deal with taller buildings of 6 to 10 stories, to manage where they go on the site, to manage the effects that way. All of these buildings require a resource consent, and in that process we'll use those residential design principles to look at how they affect the amenity of the surrounding houses in the same way that we do now. And we'll look at the effects on privacy and the effects on light and shade, but bearing in mind that there's this very strong direction from the government that we do actually have to allow these tall buildings to be built. And in doing those, applying those principles, we're looking to manage the character and appearance of the development, as well as effects on neighbours in the street. Can I have the next slide, please? I think Ike's going to then talk about some of the zones and how they fit in.
Great, thanks very much, David. So as you can see on the image there, this is trying to provide a bit of an example for how this looks in terms of the mapping that we have released, the digital web mapping that's available through the website as well. And so what you can see there, like we've talked about previously, in the centre there's no height limit given the central city nature there, and also surrounding that we have a 10-storey height limit through that peach area, and also the pink area at the bottom there representing the commercial mixed use aspects. Then everything in green in this image really is enabling up to 6 stories, and then that cascades down to I guess what will become the standard of MDRS around that, enabling 3 or 4 stories for all those yellow areas around there. What you can see on the top towards the right there as well is a blue block with the status quo over it, and this is trying to represent, excuse me, where there are proposed to be qualifying matter overlays, and in this instance I believe is proposed to be a residential character area, and fundamentally the concept is to retain the existing status quo controls that are within the district plan, subject to their applicability for the intensification direction that's there. So for any of the qualifying matters that we propose, we also must evaluate how much development against the baseline of MDRS or the NPSUD is still appropriate in order to keep or respond to that particular qualifying matter as well. So just to highlight how it looks from a mapping perspective there with those blue areas on the mapping. Next slide, please.
So another opportunity to ask some questions, and I do have a couple for the team here. One for you, Dave. Do the residential design principles make consideration for communal living, for example, large families who want to live together across several dwellings?
So that would come in consideration of how the outdoor living space works. So you're able to combine your outdoor living space and provide a certain amount that's for a pool of houses. That would certainly work. Beyond that, I don't think they would preclude such an arrangement, but it isn't, I'm not sure, specifically allowed for in them. That's a kind of proposal that it would be able to be assessed and would likely be granted under the current framework.
Just picking up on that, in terms of the medium density controls for outdoor living, effectively what it does is prescribe a minimum area that needs to be allocated per residential unit, and that can be done as a sum for communal living arrangements as well, but recognising that that's for up to 3 units, and so beyond that there is a resource consent trigger, and so those residential design principles that David mentioned would kick in to address those.
So here's another one for you. What about the privacy of existing backyards that are not currently overlooked by a 4 to 6 story high neighbour? What's consideration is given to those?
Do you want me to answer that?
Yeah, maybe if I start with the MDRS side of things, and then and maybe in terms of breach of the design principles, you can cover it off if you like, David. So effectively, we are required to give effect to the enabled height that's there, and also the recession planes that need to be enacted as well. So this does provide for a fairly liberalised regime, being taken at 4 metres rather than about the 2.3 that's typically done around residential areas, and then also taken at 60 degrees as well, which is fairly enabling overall. And there's also a larger amount of relaxation of setbacks depending on whichever zone you're in also. So that's it's important to remember that that is the baseline in terms of what council has to consider. But David, maybe if you want to cover off some of the design principle elements.
It is one of the matters of consideration, so we will look at that issue when an application comes in, but we do have to consider it on the basis that there is quite a lot of development allowed, and there would be an assumption that you would experience some adverse privacy effects. So we would look into it, and we would try to minimise the amount of people that overlook a garden directly, but ultimately there would be some allowance for it to happen, because that's the direction of the government policy.
Thank you. What about, will development proposals need an engineering approval phase before building consents will be considered?
Yeah, I mean, all of that needs to be considered as part of the building consent process anyway, in terms of engineering suitability. So just highlighting that it isn't a resource consent matter in terms of the engineering of the building structure itself, and that'll be addressed through the building consent process.
And finally, what just a bit of clarification, please, around when the MDRS takes effect. And
sure.
When.
So in terms of when it takes effect, the Act states that the MDRS standards, or the medium density residential standards, as they're drafted within the Act, will take immediate legal effect upon notification, which, like I said, needs to happen by the 20th of August this year, so a few months away. And from that point, that will be able to be given effect to as a permitted activity, so without resource consent. Just noting, however, that council has proposed to make certain aspects as part of this proposal draft that we've released more lenient, and make any other adjustments or otherwise for new standards as well. Those elements won't have immediate legal effect. It's only the MDRS standards as they're drafted within the Act having immediate legal effect, and also the areas where there are qualifying matter overlays, for example, the heritage areas or character areas that I mentioned previously, any area that's covered under qualifying matter also won't have any MDRS applied immediately or otherwise upon notification as well.
Excellent, thank you very much. So we'll continue with the presentation now. There is still one more chance to ask some questions at the end of this. So if I can get the next slide, please. So thank you very much for the presentation, guys. Hopefully for those listening in, it's provided some good information to help you provide some feedback. And you can provide your feedback until the 13th of May. Next slide, please. So we are consulting at the moment on 4 plan changes. We have the draft housing and business choice plan change, and with it the qualifying matters and the associated draft plan changes. So we've got draft coastal hazards plan change, draft heritage plan change, and draft radio communication pathways. More information about all of these plan changes can be found at ccc.govt.nz/have-your-say. Next slide, please.
So I think, like we've talked about throughout this presentation, there is quite a high degree of intensification that is directed upon council. So when providing feedback, it's important to recognise the areas where we can influence and also the areas where we need to accept. So in terms of the intensification direction upon council to give effect to the likes of MDRS or other intensification notification or associated provisions, that is directed by national legislation and so that's certainly an element that we do need to accept. The areas that we can influence and where we encourage feedback on is where council has sought to provide for or propose to provide for development above and beyond those minimum standards, so intensification, for example, beyond 6 stories, and also where we provide for that and the rationale for the extent of that intensification as well. Next slide, please. And so, like I said, there is a fairly directed decision-making process that this plan change must give effect to through the legislation. And so it is quite important, if you are interested, to provide feedback on this process, to be engaged early, because it is, like I said before, quite constrained. So this is really the best opportunity to provide open feedback as such on the intensification. Sorry, I was just muted. Before it gets formally notified in August 2022, so in a few months' time as well. And so, like I said before, once it gets notified, there is a statutory timeframe that there is formal submissions, open formal submissions being a 20 working day period or about a month's time as well. So once again, if you are interested, it is important that you are involved at the onset as part of that as well. Next slide, please.
So we've come to the final opportunity to ask any questions, and we do have one that I'd like to put to team, and it's around car parking. So car parks are not required with the MDRS. If car parks are proposed to be provided, will any standards apply to them?
Yeah, good question. So just a bit of context for everyone. So the NPSUD, which directs that large degree of intensification, also sought to remove the ability for council to require parking as part of any development within any district plan across the country. So it's not just a Christchurch thing or a larger centres thing, it's across all district plans. And that had to be removed from all district plans by, I believe it was the 18th of February this year. So it's no longer any control within the district plan. However, there is a requirement to provide for the likes of disabled parking and for loading bays as well. And then just touching on the question as well, if parking is provided, which people are freely able to do so, then that has a standard, I guess, dimension and turning circles and manoeuvrability and things like that that all need to be addressed and adhered to, which are prescribed through the district plan as well.
Excellent, thank you very much. So we'll now move to the last slide of the presentation now, and just thank you to everyone who's taken time out of their evening today to find out more about our proposed changes and its implications. But while we're not able to change government legislation, we're really keen to hear from you on how you think our city needs to respond to legislation and to make it work for Christchurch. So just to reiterate some of the housekeeping here, we will be making this webinar available on our website along with a copy of the presentation and a transcript of the questions that we have got through those 3 ways: Slido, on engagement inbox, and through the Q&A on Teams. We won't be monitoring Slido for the rest of the evening, so we're about to close it off with the questions, but we will be providing answers to those questions, and if we haven't managed to provide it during the course of this presentation, we will do so and pop it up online for you. If you've got any feedback about your experience tonight and how you found the webinar, we'd love to hear it, and you can email us, the engagement team, at engagement@ccc.govt.nz. If you've got any issues specifically related to the plan change team would love to hear it, and the email is up on the screen there as well, along with a phone number. We've got one more webinar in our series that you might like to attend, and that's tomorrow night, and that's on commercial intensification. So look, thanks again for myself, Ike, David and the team. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night.